Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for another review, this time of the 1988 book by James M. McPherson, Battle Cry of Freedom, the Civil War Era. James M. McPherson, again, really nice to talk about authors who are still with us. Thankfully to say he is still with us at the age of 87, about to turn 88 later on this week, in fact, so happy early birthday to him. Comes from actually the upper Midwest where I come from. Went to school in St. Peter, went to Gustavus Adolphus down there, which I'm familiar with. Went into, got his doctorate in history, became a professor at Princeton where he taught for a number of years. And McPherson's focus, as one might expect, is in the history of the Civil War. And the angle that McPherson takes as he starts his career in kind of the mid-1960s is understanding how the Civil War tied into race relations in the country, both during the actual time of the Civil War and after the fact during the Reconstruction era. McPherson has published a number of different books on those topics and on various other topics, and you can tell that that is his sort of niche, that is sort of his kind of emphasis in his research. And undoubtedly that was part of why McPherson was picked to write this volume. So the Battle Cry of Freedom is part of a multi-part series called The Oxford History of the United States. It has been a series that has been ongoing since the early 80s. I believe this was the second volume in that series, and is still having books published as recently as I think 2017 is the most recent, and there's still a couple of others that are in the works apparently. And I think there's clearly intention behind, because the first one was the Glorious Cause, which I have not read. It's a book on the American Revolution. There's clearly intention about the American Revolution and the Civil War being the first two major events in American history that are addressed. And part of McPherson's angle, both throughout his other writings from what I'm aware of, but especially in this book as well, is that there is such a huge element of revolution in this theme of freedom and what it means to be free that, you know, completely encompasses this entire Civil War dynamic. And in many ways that makes it directly tied to the American Revolution, coming from definitely not the same like inflection points, the same points of conflict, but coming from similar desires to achieve freedom and to be freed from control of those who are perceived to be controlling them, whoever that might be. And that goes for both sides. McPherson takes that approach and trying to explain kind of the logic behind. On the one hand, you have, of course, the cry of freedom coming from those people who were enslaved. On the other side, you have the folks on the Confederate side who are more so, you know, they're fighting against what they perceive to be some sort of oppressive states' rights kind of issue, right? Where the federal government is impeding upon their rights to exist and to do quote unquote business as they see fit. And that's the dynamic that takes place. Now, I've not read any of the other volumes in the Oxford history, but from what I understand of the individuals who kind of have edited the series and oversaw its development initially, and the backgrounds of the writers who have been chosen for it, this is a very, I'm going to say, left-leaning and modernist approach to talking about American history. I'm not going to quite say progressive deeply, because I think, again, what progressive means now compared to what progressive meant in 1988 when this was written are two very different things. But it is an approach to writing that I think, especially with the turns that Civil War scholarship seems to have taken in the last 30 to 40 years, have made this book age well. This is a book that is still in print. You can find it at almost any bookstore that has a Civil War history section. I see it in new bookstores. I see it in used bookstores all the time. And I was curious, kind of how well this book has aged, because obviously it was a very successful upon its release. It won a Pulitzer Prize, and it still, from my understanding, has received fairly positive reviews from actual historians and that sort of thing. But granted, this is still a book that has come out in 1988. This is still a book that is over 35 years old at this point. And one does not have the benefit of coming from years, the years of scholarship and research and that sort of thing, as well as just kind of updated and evolved political opinions that have come since the 80s. It doesn't reap those benefits. So it's very interesting. I was very curious to see how it would kind of end up. And, when comparing this with the Shelby Foote multi-part narrative, which I've received some criticism for my review of that, which I put out a few weeks ago. It's very interesting because I think the books are different in how they approach the topic and how they execute the history. And I'll start by saying that the Shelby Foote multi-part history, for all of the flaws that it clearly has, if you ask anybody who knows what they're talking about the Civil War, those books still benefit from a sense of narrative, a real sense of like authorial voice. Foote is really good at telling yarns. He's really good at telling stories, and that goes throughout that whole 3-part series. McPherson is not the prose writer that Foote is, by any means. And I also don't think that's the point, because McPherson is coming at it from an historian's lens. He's coming at it from a historical perspective, and immediately he leads into it by taking care of two of the things, maybe the two biggest issues that I had with the Shelby Foote books. Number one, you don't have to worry about source citation at all in this book. There are footnotes. There are a plethora of footnotes to be found. It's to be expected, of course. This is, very much in academics history in a lot of ways. Even if it is marketed as a popular history, and even if it is written more accessibly, ultimately this is still written by professional historians, and there are certain standards that they want to meet. So I appreciate the heavy use of footnotes and the heavy use of not just citing the sources, but understanding the overall context of where they were pulled from. One thing I really like about footnotes is when they contextualize, hey, here's all these other things that are also related to this source, whether that's other sources, whether that's, hey, here's more context for what these papers are that we're pulling this story or this anecdote from. I really like it when books and when authors do that, and McPherson does it pretty liberally here. The other thing that it does, and this is maybe not an issue with the Foote book necessarily, but more so just something that I was looking for more as someone who is trying to learn more about the Civil War. McPherson is clearly looking at telling a much broader story than just a military history. If you want a straight up military history, again, I can't promise that the Foote books are super accurate because I don't have the knowledge to cross-check his knowledge of troop movements and strategies and things like that. But McPherson is clearly interested in talking about the broader social context of everything. You get a lot of background information from the 40, 50 years and even beyond before you actually get into the conflict itself. You're talking about, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and all these events and the consequences of those events that built themselves into what became the Civil War. You're not kind of dropped in media res into the whole thing like you are with the Shelby Foote books. And the other part that I appreciate too is this, kind of macro, this kind of step back perspective, this vantage point that never gets too laser focused on one thing, this broader focus that continues throughout the whole story. This is not a book where you are going to get super granular into the details of military movements and things like that at the expense of everything else. And don't get me wrong, I think McPherson does an excellent job of explaining the military strategy in a way that I could pick up on a lot more than the denser explanations in the foot book. In the foot books, I should say. I think he explains it well. They're not ignored by any means, but there's a broader context because he's also talking about political maneuverings. He's talking about the social contexts. This is really, like, compared to the foot volumes, I think you really get to hear more from the perspective of African Americans and Black people, whether that's during the time they were enslaved, whether that's during the actual war itself when they were potentially fighting for the cause, and the ways in which they assisted the cause, ways in which they sacrificed themselves or were murdered for the cause. I think McPherson understands that importance, and that's part of why I harp on the point of his own background as a researcher and the things that he talks about in his other writings, because that perspective informs the whole arc of this book. It's really, I think from a pacing standpoint, as I said, this is very accessibly written. Even if the writing is not colorful, I think it is fairly easy to read. For being about an 800-ish page book, it really didn't feel like it. It felt really breezy. I think there's still a lot of information you have to absorb because it's a very complicated situation, but you're never so lost in the microscopic details that it overwhelms you. At least I wasn't. And that's a huge plus. Now, as far as how well this book has aged, it's hard to say. And I think this is where I might ask anyone who's watching this video to kind of give a little bit more perspective on, what other one-volume histories of the Civil War have come out since this one. This one was always kind of on my bucket list because it is a very notable book, a very acclaimed book. It's one of, I think, again, still to this day, from my understanding, one of the most acclaimed, if not the most acclaimed, single-volume history of the war. So I don't necessarily know if we've had another one since then that has equaled this or bettered it, but if anyone has any suggestions, I'm certainly open to taking them. But I think that overall, the grace and the detail and the intentionality of McPherson's approach in this book is really well taken. And I think it has, from my vantage point, aged the book very well. I think this is a book that if you were to pick it up and read it today, if you were someone who, like myself, maybe doesn't have a super great working knowledge of the details of the Civil War besides your basic like Pickett's Charge and all that, if you're just trying to learn that information and kind of start from scratch, if you will, I see no reason to say that this book is subpar in any way. I think this gets the job done. And I also don't think there's any part of this book where you're going to feel like there's a character portrait of somebody or a group of people that has aged particularly poorly, where you're like, oh, I think that was a misfire, compared to Shelby Foote's books, where I feel like maybe you could argue that. So yeah, I think Battle Cry of Freedom is really successful and really worth your time. But again, make sure to check it out and let me know what you think, and let me know if you have any other suggestions for these one-volume histories. I'm really curious to kind of know what people's thoughts are on other Civil War histories. I'm sure interested to check them out, and supplemental histories as well, if there are other ones that you're kind of curious about, or if there are other ones that you've read that you'd recommend as far as, hey, here's books about certain aspects of the war. I'm intrigued to hear about those as well. With that, I want to thank you all so much for watching this. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.